I'm the most cold-blooded son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Ted Bundy, one of history's most infamous serial killers, embodies the chilling duality of charm and depravity. A charismatic law student with ambitions to rub elbows with Washington's political elite, Bundy's promising future was shattered by his sinister urges and violent fantasies. Beneath his polished exterior lurked a predator who began stalking female college students, leaving a trail of terror. By 1974, several vibrant young women vanished across Washington and Utah, their disappearances haunting local communities. Though Bundy's girlfriend grew suspicious and alerted detectives, few could believe that such a clean-cut, all-American scholar could be capable of such monstrous acts. Before we dive deeper into this gripping tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Bone Chill Files channel. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your engagement helps get these chilling stories to you faster. Now let's unravel the dark legacy of Ted Bundy. Fact sheet on Ted Bundy. By 1975, he attempted to kidnap a potential victim who escaped, providing investigators with their first solid lead on the rapist and murderer who brazenly called himself Ted. Bundy would eventually be caught and sentenced to prison, from where he would escape and travel to Florida where he attacked several sorority girls, leaving 2 dead. His last murder would secure his death sentence, and he spent several years on death row prior to his execution in 1989. Before his death, he would confess to his involvement in the murders of over 30 young women and girls, making him one of the most notorious and prolific serial killers of the 20th century. Ted Bundy, the early years. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946 to Eleanor Louise Cowell, who gave birth to the boy at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. The identity of Ted's parentage would prove to be a contentious issue, and his paternity was clouded in mystery. Because his mother was unwed, he spent the first 3 years of his life living with his grandparents to avoid the stigma associated with birth outside wedlock. As he grew older, the young Ted was told his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister, and this deception was also told to friends and other family members. When he was older, Ted discovered the truth, and the experience had a profound effect on him, and manifested into resentment towards his mother for never discussing his real father with him. By 1951, his mother Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who worked as a hospital cook, and they married the following year. The couple eventually conceived 4 children together, and Ted was formally adopted by Johnny Bundy, taking his surname as his own, despite his dislike of his stepfather, who he referred to as not very bright, and his limited financial income. During his formative years, Bundy was considered shy and withdrawn by his friends and family, but displayed none of the characteristics that would define his adulthood. In his own estimation, Ted Bundy would later describe how he would search through neighborhood trash cans as a kid, looking for pictures of naked women, and how he developed an interest in crime novels, detective magazines, and true crime documentaries that fueled a growing fascination with the illustrations of mutilated and dead women. The family was dominated by his grandfather, Samuel Cowell, who was described as a tyrannical bully who would react violently towards others, abusing even the family pet. Ted, however, idolized his grandfather, whom he respected and held in high regard, despite his abusive tendencies towards his family. Ted was considered somewhat popular at school, but would later claim to prefer his own solitary company, which he attributed to his inability to understand and form interpersonal relationships. He often found it difficult to make friends and didn't have romantic relationships during his high school years. It was during these years that he began stealing from his school, supermarkets, and residential homes, resulting in his adept acquisition of many of his possessions in later life. He became quite an accomplished thief, and rarely bought anything of value, preferring the exhilaration of taking something to possess, and he was arrested twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. His record was expunged after his 18th birthday, giving him a clean slate. Upon his graduation in 1965, Bundy spent a year at the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. It was there he became romantically involved with Diane Edwards, a fellow classmate at the university. Edwards was from a prominent family from California, and was everything Bundy aspired to be: confident, self-assured, and successful in all that she did. By early 1968 he had dropped out of college and was worked in several minimum-wage jobs before volunteering in Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign to further his own political aspirations. Around this time in March 1968, Diane Edwards ended their relationship, citing her frustration at Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. He was devastated by this rejection, and it would be a focal point of his later obsession with women who resembled his first love interest. Ted Bundy, the evolution of a serial killer. After a brief fling with a woman named Kathy Swindler in April 1968, Bundy traveled to Colorado and then Arkansas and Philadelphia to visit relatives. He returned to Washington in the fall of 1969, and it was then that he met Elizabeth Klopfer. On Friday, September 26, 1969, 23-year-old Ted went to the Sandpiper Tavern, a college beer joint with some friends where he saw 24-year-old Liz Klopfer across the crowded dance floor. When he drank a sufficient amount of beer to pluck up the courage, he asked her to dance, and when she demurred, saying she couldn't, he asked her friend who accepted. He later saw her on the dance floor and commented amusingly, "You really can't dance, can you?" Liz found Ted handsome and charming, and he accompanied her home that night and they slept together. It was the start of a tumultuous relationship, one that was characterized by Bundy's deceptive personality contrasted against Liz's trusting nature. In May 1970, Ted Bundy began working for the medical supply company Pedline, driving a delivery truck. He began stealing and was once caught taking a photograph from a doctor's office. He was let off by his boss with a stern lecture, and it was only later that they found out he was stealing from them too. He would later use the supplies he stole, such as crutches and a container of plaster casting material, to lure women into thinking he was physically impaired and needed their help. During the summer of 1970, Ted saved a 3.5-year-old toddler from drowning in Green Lake, in Seattle's North End. He was the only one who saw the child wander away from her parents and then dashed into the water to save the youngster. For this he was commended in the local newspapers, and it was the first time the name Ted Bundy appeared in the press. He decided to enroll at the University of Washington in August to study psychology, and this around the time he began to stalk the campus grounds looking for widows he could peep into and watch women undress. Sometime in September 1971, he began working for the Seattle Crisis Clinic call center. One night a week he would take calls from the frantic, the lonely, and sometimes the suicidal. At least once a month he would deal with a high-drama call from someone who had already taken pills or slit their wrists, and Ted would keep the caller on the line long enough for the number to be traced, and most often heard the police breaking into their homes to save them. During his time there, he also dealt with a lot of lonely women who had been abandoned by their husbands, so were reaching out because they were alone, and he would offer his support. It was during the end of 1971 and the beginning of 1972 when Bundy began disabling women's cars by pulling out the rotor device of their motor distributors. He also tried to deflate their tires, but this type of approach always failed because the campus had plenty of men to help a woman stranded with car trouble. He began to get strong urges of wanting to get a woman alone, and often felt this way after alcohol had lowered his inhibitions. He discovered an enjoyment of the power he had over a woman in a vulnerable situation and found himself more attracted to them. He once disabled a woman's car just to see her made more vulnerable. One evening in February 1972, he stalked a woman from a bar and got ahead of her to lie in wait. As she approached, he intended to hit her across the head with a piece of wood he found, but she stopped at her door before his hiding place and went inside. Although he hadn't attacked the woman, it had a profound effect on him, and he felt it was like making a hole in a dam. Several nights later he came across a woman fumbling with her keys at her front door and struck her across the head with a piece of heavy wood. When she collapsed screaming, he fled. After this incident he became racked with remorse and promised himself he would never do such a thing again. Ted and Liz briefly broke up in May 1972, and he discontinued his volunteer work at the crisis clinic when he was hired under a federal grant to work with psychiatric outpatients at Seattle's Harborview Hospital as a counselor. Liz learned of an affair Ted was having with Sandy Gwynn, a fellow Harborview counselor. She later told police that she noticed Ted had become cold and abusive with his cases. The hospital staff also suspect Bundy of calling patients late at night, making anonymous threat, and speaking inappropriately of sexual matters. Gwynn would later elaborate on their relationship to detectives, when they contacted her after Bundy's capture. She told them they only had intercourse once, and although he had been affectionate and tender towards her, she described the encounter as unpleasant. "We went for a picnic in April on Hump Tulips River, and I had quite a lot of wine. I was dizzy and he kept dunking my head under. He was trying to untie the top of my bikini. He couldn't manage it, and he suddenly pulled my bikini bottoms off and had intercourse with me. He didn't say anything, and he had his forearm pressed under my chin so hard that I couldn't breathe. I kept telling him I couldn't breathe, but he didn't let up the pressure until he was finished. There was no affection at all. Afterwards it was like it never happened. We drove home and he talked about his family, everyone but his father. I broke up with him because of his other girlfriend. She was almost hysterical when she found me with him once. Detectives were interested in other aspects of their affair, specifically the long drives Bundy would take her on through the hills behind Lake Sammamish State Park. It would be this area where some of his victims would later be found. Gwynn told investigators about these drives saying, Ted was supposedly looking for an aunt or some old woman who was family. He said he was trying to find her place. I'll never forget it because it was my car and my gas and I was not exactly pleased to do this. I kept driving and I kept saying to Ted, what does the place look like? At least tell me what the place looks like so I can help. There was never any description. We just drove around. Ted and Liz would eventually resume their relationship by May 1972 and she began to see glimpses of the other side to his character. He once told her he would break your fucking neck if she ever exposed his shoplifting. She recalled to detectives that one evening he came to her home to retrieve a crowbar he left under her radiator. She saw something bulging out of his pocket and pulled it out. It was a surgical glove. Their sex life became more erratic and she once caught him examining her body with a flashlight under the bedclothes. After buying Alex Comfort's Joy of Sex, Ted attempted to talk her into anal sex and bondage, but she refused, agreeing only to let him tie her up. For this he used her pantyhose, which he suspiciously found in her bureau without directions. Several months later in August 1972, Bundy stalked a campus waitress as she walked home and peeped in as she undressed. He continued doing it again and again until one day he found the door was unlocked and sneaked inside. When he entered her bedroom and jumped on her, she screamed and he ran away. Again there was the period of self-disgust and remorse, but these moments were becoming few and far between. After he attacked an unidentified woman in November 1972, clubbing her over the head and running off when she screamed, it took only a month to get over it. In May 1973, Bundy started a job in Olympia with Ross Davis, the new head of the state GOP Central Committee. He began to earn decent money for the first time, taking $1,000 a month for studying cost overruns in the party computer system. He also worked on several other projects and grew close to Davis. Although no body was ever recovered, detectives strongly believe Bundy was involved in the disappearance of an unidentified hitchhiker who was abducted near Olympia, Washington in May 1973. He is also suspected of the murder of 17-year-old Rita Jolly, who vanished for West Lynn, Oregon in June 1973, as well as 25-year-old Vicki Lynn Holler who went missing in Eugene, Oregon in August 1973. However, detectives never got a chance to interview him about these disappearances. Bundy would claim he didn't start killing until 1973, which would support the timeline of his progression from a peeping Tom, stalker, rapist, and finally serial murderer. Throughout early 1973, Ted had been in sporadic contact with his ex Diane Edwards, whose rejection of their relationship had caused him to reevaluate his prospects in life. He had cleaned up his image, became more self-assured, and was confident in his education. In July 1973 he flew to San Francisco to visit her. She was clearly impressed with his transformation and they renewed their relationship, which he kept secret from Liz. During that autumn, Liz found a bag of women's clothing in his apartment. On another occasion she came across a container of plaster which, unbeknown to her, Ted had stolen from his job with Pedline. She also found a pair of crutches but said she was too embarrassed to say anything to him. One day they were out shopping and he spotted a purse snatcher and ran after the suspect and held him down until the police arrived. He was mentioned in the Seattle Times for his heroism. It was the first but wouldn't be the last time Ted Bundy was mentioned in the newspapers. By September 2, 1973, Ted had proposed to Diane and they became engaged, all whilst maintaining an unsteady relationship with Liz. Ted Bundy and the Washington and Oregon murders. Ted Bundy reapplied to the University of Utah in December 1973 and spent the new year with Diane Edwards, who came to visit him for several days before flying back home to California on January 2, 1974. Despite finally rekindling his long-sought relationship with Diane, he was finding it increasingly difficult to keep it secret from Liz. By the new year, Ted was working as assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and had written a pamphlet advising women on rape prevention. But it would be around January 1974 when women started to disappear in Washington state. On January 4, 1974, 18-year-old student Karen Sparks was found by her friend in her bed, covered in blood. She had been viciously attacked and beaten about the head. As her roommate removed the bed covers, she saw even more horrific injuries, A bed rod had been torn from the headboard and rammed into her vagina. She was taken to the hospital where she would remain in a coma for several months. Although she recovered, she suffered from permanent brain damage as a result of the assault. His involvement in the attack on Karen Sparks was never fully established, but it fit his subsequent modus operandi of entering a victim's residence to bludgeon and rape. Bundy would later alter his MO, targeting women in outdoor areas, often with a ruse involving a broken arm which was encased in the plaster cast he stole from Pedline. In the case of his next victim, he changed his MO again, kidnapping her from her own home. 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy was abducted from her basement bedroom on January 31, 1974, in what would be Ted Bundy's first official murder victim. Her friends found her room empty, and upon closer inspection they discovered her blood-stained pillowcase and blood-soaked bedsheets. Bundy had stalked Healy earlier that day, visiting a Safeway store at the same time as her, before breaking into her home while she was out running errands. Victims and suspected victims of Ted Bundy. He would later speculate about her murder to detectives, revealing details in a third-person perspective that she was battered unconscious and then carried to his car. He then drove to Taylor Mountain, which was 20 miles east of Seattle, and there made her remove her pajamas and raped her. She was then bludgeoned to death and her body partially buried and left for scavengers. He would go into his phase of remorse and self-loathing over what he had done, but it only lasted a few weeks. On February 4, 1974, an unidentified male called the emergency service number 911 telling the operator, "Listen and listen carefully. The person who attacked that girl on 4th last month and the person who took Linda Healy are one and the same. He was outside both houses. He was seen." When the operator questioned the caller's identity, the man replied, "No way are you going to get my name," and promptly hung up. Later that month, Ted had his final confrontation with Diane Edwards. He hadn't spoken to her properly since her New Year visit, and had hoped that by ignoring her the whole situation would go away. Just as he returned home after taking the law school aptitude test, she rang his apartment on February 16. She screamed and yelled at him, asking why he hadn't called or written to her, and Ted's reply came as a result of the several beers he had drank beforehand. When she told him never to contact her again, he replied, "Well, far out, you know." When she hung up, he opened another beer and would later explain how he felt relieved the stress was now off his shoulders. The next month he continued his prowling and stalking. On March 2, 1974, a 22-year-old woman had gone to bed around 1 a.m. when she was awoken around 4 a.m. and was startled to see an unknown figure in her bedroom. She could see he'd left a flashlight in the living room which illuminated his silhouette, and she watched as he came and sat on her bed. He told her to relax, that he wouldn't hurt her, and she asked him how he got into her home, to which he replied, "It's none of your business." She later recalled to investigators that he was wearing an old t-shirt, jeans, and a dark navy blue baseball cap that covered his face to his chin. She remembered it not being a ski mask, but some kind of homemade mask with slits for the eyes. She said the man sounded educated and she could smell alcohol on his breath. He pulled out a knife with a carved handle and told her he wouldn't use it if she complied. He then blindfolded her and raped her. When he was done, he tied her hands and feet to slow her down, as he explained, and then she heard him go into the living room and crawl through the window. She heard his footsteps as he ran from her building toward the alley. She didn't hear a car and believed the man sounded confident, as if he had done it before. I think this is a good time to end part 1 of this story. If you find this story interesting and curious to know what will happen next, who will be the next unfortunate victim of the creepy murderer under this elegant suit, please quickly register, like, share so we have the motivation to release new videos as soon as possible. Thank you and have a beautiful evening, sweet dreams.